Hello, everybody. Welcome. Go ahead and take your seats. We're going to get moving. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ASU California Center here in the historic Herald Examiner building. I'm Luke Tate, Managing Director of ASU's Office of Applied Innovation. We have a mission of expanding access to educational and economic opportunity. And I was grateful as part of that mission to be able to partner with Ram M Pendyala on some of the work he's going to talk about today relative to autonomous vehicles. As we began that work, what came to my mind was a story about a young woman who had been in and out of poverty. She was living with her aunt and her uncle at the time, and she got a job at a local Walmart. And for the first time, she finally began to feel a little bit of stability in her life. Within a couple months, she was actually Employee of the Month. The very next month, she won Employee of the Month the second time in a row. And she really began to feel like she was hitting her stride. Until she woke up one morning and hopped in the pickup truck and found out that her uncle had run it down to zero. There was no gas. And she had no way to work, no way to get to work. And she got fired that very same day for not showing up to her shift. And what she lost wasn't just a job, and it wasn't just a fall back into poverty. As she explained it, what she felt like she lost was her agency, her independence, a bit of her humanity. And so as we think about the ways in which autonomous vehicles will change our world and can change our cities, I think we also think about how they can change lives and how greater access to mobility for more populations who lack it will enable them to find more of their own humanity and more agency in that. And so I hope we can keep that in mind as we talk today. I'm honored to welcome to the stage the moderator for this panel, Marisa Walker from the Arizona Commerce Authority. Thank you so much. Please take it away.
Wonderful. Well, first, let me thank the organizers for the opportunity to come and talk and have this timely discussion. I was mentioning that I've been here for the past week participating in the ITS World Congress and really invigorating discussions, but candidly, probably not enough about mobility solutions for particularly disadvantaged populations or those with different transportation needs and things like that. So really a unique opportunity to kind of dive into this a little bit. Also want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule to come and be with us today as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to move into a discussion, but let me go ahead and have the panelists go ahead and self-introduce. Maybe we can Evelyn, we can start with you way on the end and work our way back over here, and then we'll ask Ram to come up and make a few contextual remarks.
Great. Is this on now? Try again?
Yeah,
there we go. Good morning, everybody. My name is Evelyn Blumenberg, and I'm a professor of urban planning in UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, where I also direct the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies that does work on policy issues related to the larger LA region.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Tsuei, Director of IT at ASU Services, in charge of the technology and innovation. I had the honor work for Valley Metro a few years ago, and then also knowing Carol very much. Thank you.
Is that on? Or it was on? Now it's on.
Not yet.
Now it's on?
Oh, yay.
Good morning. My name's Carol Ketcherside, and I am the Deputy Director for Service Planning and Innovation at Valley Metro in Phoenix, Arizona. We're the regional public transportation organization in Phoenix and the surrounding area. And as Bill said, he worked with us, so he's an old friend of mine. I have been there for 16 years, but I have been in public transportation ever since I graduated from college, so I'm not going to say how long that's been, but anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm sure that Dr. Pendyala will make reference to this, but we worked together on a public transportation Waymo project not very long ago, so he was a great partner, ASU was a great partner in that. So.
Thank you, Carol. Ram Pendyala. So, as the slide shows, I'm a professor at Arizona State University in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. I also serve as the director for the TOMNET University Transportation Center, which is a Tier 1 UTC sponsored by the U.S. Department of Transportation. We're very grateful. And indeed had the honor and privilege of working with Carol and her colleagues at Valley Metro on one of the major pilot demonstrations as part of an FTA-sponsored Mobility on Demand project.
Now it's my turn. Hello. Good. Good morning, everyone. Gwo-Wei Torng from Federal Transit Administration is one of the operating administration under US DOT. I'm the Director for Mobility Innovation at FTA. Thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, real pleasure. They're all being really incredibly modest about their background and the depth of their expertise, but we'll start to dig into that a little bit once we get into the questions. And I was remiss, I should have probably put myself a little bit more in context. Marisa Walker, I'm with the Arizona Commerce Authority, so I work with several people here, traveling over from Arizona. We're the state's economic development entity, and typically in our wheelhouse we would be working with companies, helping them grow, attracting them to the state, and then really trying to foster the startup space. But a couple years ago, the governor established by executive order an Institute of Automated Mobility with, I think, some real intentionality around trying to get researchers at both the public and private sectors, along with transportation officials around the state to be more engaged in not only the development of the research, but also in just learning about the technology itself. And so we're still in our infancy. It's been 3 years, but it's been just quite a really interesting journey just to be able to see the various viewpoints. So this will be a really interesting conversation as well when we try to put this over with the lens of mobility in its broadest sense. Ram, maybe I can go ahead and turn to you, have you come up and provide a little context before we get into the questions.
Play a little bit of musical chairs here. So thank you again. Let me add my ASU welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be here and really talking about a subject that I think we're all very, very passionate about, and that is about providing mobility and how do we leverage and harness the power of technology and all the technological advances that we're seeing to really advance mobility for all. So how can we do it in a way that really serves the community at large, regardless of socioeconomic status and background. I'm just going to give you some quick background on a couple of interesting pilot projects that we had the privilege of doing recently. And so, like all good professors, I have way more content than time, but I will try to go through them just to give you a flavor of what we have found and seen. So what have we learned from some of very recent real-world AV pilots? So we're really kind of focusing on autonomous vehicles as those are the major technological revolution that everybody's talking about, focusing on. And I'm sure at the recent ITS World Congress, there was, again, lots of sessions devoted to AVs and the promise of AVs for mobility. So the first one is the one that Carol talked about or referred to, and that's the Waymo, the partnership with Waymo, to do an AV demo, a autonomous vehicle demo in the Phoenix area. We do have Waymo vehicles providing Uber, Lyft type ride-hailing service. So you can actually summon a Waymo autonomous vehicle with absolutely no human operator in the vehicle. So it just comes to you absolutely empty. You hop in, you press a blue button, and off you go to your destination. So you can actually do that in Phoenix. That's one of the favorite things I do for anybody visiting me. I take them on a Waymo ride, and it's usually their most memorable experience. You know, everything else they forget about, but it's the Waymo ride that they go home and tell people about. And The part of this demo, what we wanted to do was really look at what's the impacts on travel if we made such a service available, and what's people's attitudes and perceptions towards an autonomous vehicle-based service. This was basically a partnership between Valley Metro and Waymo to provide rides to ADA paratransit certified individuals. These are individuals with disabilities and seniors. But of course, you had to be within the Waymo geofence territory. This is a somewhat older map. Waymo has expanded a bit beyond what you see here, but at the time of the demo, this is where they were. And highly subsidized fares, so very similar to Valley Metro's Ride Choice program that provides highly subsidized door-to-door mobility service or curb-to-curb mobility service for people in this group. Similarly, this service essentially provided very highly subsidized fares. We were brought in to do project evaluation, and so we did surveys, and we basically surveyed the participants, a small sample, but it was a very committed sample. We did surveys about their attitudes towards autonomous vehicles, etc., before the pilot, during the pilot, when they were actually able to experience the service, and after, that is after the service was finished, the pilot was all done, and we just asked them, how do you feel now about AVs now that you're back to, the traditional service. We also did some focus groups with Waymo riders, subject matter experts, etc. And we actually analyzed trip data as well. So here's some opinions about Waymo, the Waymo service itself in a post-survey. And you can just kind of focus on the green, right? The green essentially shows the positive agreement. And the statements are, I'd like to have Waymo service available permanently. I find it exciting to ride in a Waymo vehicle. I feel confident that I'm not going to have any technological problems with Waymo. I feel safe when riding. And you can just see how this, of course, it's a self-selected group, but you can see that this is the post-survey. So this is after they experienced the service. They carried with them, and they retained very positive impressions about their experience and the service that they had. If you look at the ratings they provided, this is on a scale of 5, and you can see various attributes, and they compared 3 options: regular taxi, which they have a lot of experience with because that's the traditional service that was made available to them, Uber and Lyft, ride-hailing services, and then Waymo. And you will see the purple bar consistently the highest rated among these 3 options, except for drop-off and pickup. So the automated vehicles, the Waymo vehicles, are trained through their AI systems to drop off and pick up at a safe location, not necessarily at your most convenient curb location. And so in the drop-off pickup, maybe they didn't quite feel, they had to perhaps walk or, meet the vehicle at a certain place. And so that was the only place where there was some compromise, but otherwise consistently rated the best. Now this is attitudes towards AVs in general, right? So given your experience with Waymo and how you felt with Waymo, now how do you feel about AVs? And again, you can see the green bars are generally very positive towards AVs. I'd like to see self-driving vehicles become common. I'm excited to see technological innovations. Self-driving vehicles will make traveling easier. The last one is about significantly enhancing mobility for all people. And you had a few that were somewhat neutral, but again, generally a very positive attitude and perception of what it can do for mobility. The willingness to ride in an AV, and you can see, riding with strangers, just only strangers, so there's nobody familiar, so to speak. You're riding with strangers only, and you can see the green is considerably less than riding with known passengers, that is, family and friends. And you can see the huge green for riding with known passengers, but with strangers only, I think it is still a challenge to get people to embrace sharing rides in a small enclosed vehicle with strangers, especially if there's no driver who's providing a little bit of supervision, oversight, and there to take care of things if something goes wrong. However, I did want to point out that arrow, which essentially shows after the experience, you'll see in the post-survey, the green increased. There was a little more of a positive feeling towards, hey, I might ride this AV with a stranger. So some improvement based on an actual experience. And so I think that's a key takeaway. I'm going to skip this slide again. Happy to share these slides, but this is about some of the safety is the two bottom attitudinal statements. And you can see some folks who are still neutral. I think they still want to make, kind of experience the technology to really make up their minds about the safety of these systems. And of course, some of the publicity around Tesla, crashes and so on probably are not helping with that public perceptions of safety of automated driving systems. So the takeaways, one is experience matters, right? So experiencing the service and this pilot actually impacts attitudes, impacts perceptions, and really makes people much more comfortable. And that's why you see a lot of the positive feedback that we received. So vast majority of participants eager to use AVs. People prefer sharing with known passengers. The challenge with strangers remains. 1 in 4 is still a bit on the fence with regard to AV safety, but again, we feel, as the technology matures, people get to experience it, we can overcome some of those, some of that hesitation. And Waymo was rated the best, as I had shown in the graph. Let me now talk about a second pilot, which is quite different. So if you think about Waymo, that's very much like a ride-hailing service, providing door-to-door or curb-to-curb mobility on demand based on an app, right? Now here's RoboRide, which is a low-speed autonomous shuttle that is operating on a fixed route, on a fixed schedule, right, with fixed stops. Okay, it's very much like a transit service. So very much like a transit service, we deployed this in the city of Peoria's medical district. And this was through a partnership between the city of Peoria and our other wonderful agency in the valley, the Maricopa Association of Governments, that is implementing emerging technological advances and doing some of these pilots. And so here's the project overview. You can see the pre-designated route that covers the medical district, serving some assisted living communities and so on, senior communities. We did the pilot for about 4 or 5 months, and one loop was just about 2.5 miles, but it took about 45 minutes. So this is a low-speed autonomous shuttle, okay? And but it's free, absolutely free to hop on, hop off with 13 stops. These were the project goals, to check it all out, see what that entails. We did some surveys. We did some quick intercept surveys. In fact, some of my glorious students who are here, they were the ones in the field, collecting these surveys. We also administered a full survey to residents in the buffer area of this medical district. And so we had a decent sample size here with respect to survey responses. And I'm going to focus on the 274. So I'm just going to focus on the full survey where we had about 274 complete responses. Now look at the top right. You'll see the number of RoboRide trips taken. Among these 274, actually 88% never used the service. Okay, so only 12% even tried using the service. And among that 12%, which is 34 people, you can see the number of trips taken in the bottom left graph. Okay, but you can just see this service didn't quite take off, didn't quite get embraced by the public in that area, and so there's just very low levels of usage for this type of service. The majority of users who did use it, okay, so if you just take that 34 people who tried it, they found it safe, comfortable, and useful, and perhaps that's why they used it. So it was positive for that small group of user base. But then we, of course, focused on the other 240 who did not use it and asked them, well, why did you not use it? And you'll see the three major top reasons are no need. I just don't have a need for that kind of service. Unknown schedule or inconvenient stops, or less convenient than other modes. And this remains a challenge for modes of transportation that are on fixed routes, fixed schedules, fixed stops, slower in speed or travel time. Those barriers remain, and so we're not so sure as to how a low-speed autonomous shuttle in that kind of a setting might work. Now, if you come to the ASU campus where there's thousands and thousands of students who are just trying to get between classes and so on, perhaps it'll be a very different story, and that is a conversation we're having with MAG and some shuttle providers to see if there's opportunities to deploy in a university campus setting. Otherwise, the findings, again, I'll kind of skip over some of this, but you can see there's, the green is there, but again, not as much at all as you saw with the Waymo pilot. A lot more neutral stance as to the interest in really embracing this type of a low-speed autonomous shuttle. We do see some differences now with respect to what extent will you switch to an AV service once it's available on a permanent large scale. And you can see gender differences, male versus female, and you can actually see limitations. So if you have a mobility limitation of some sort, you can actually see a difference there. So those with a limitation, a little more inclined to embrace it. And again, we see a male versus female difference. And I think these kinds of differences need to be considered if we want to make sure that AVs are deployed in a way that is inclusive. And so I just wanted to bring that out with this slide. Again, this is a low-speed autonomous shuttle. Average speeds were about 5 miles per hour. And so certainly we feel that is a bit of an impediment in terms of people feeling very good about using the service. There were quite a few disengagements, and that probably did not help. And so there were about 9.1 disengagements per day. You can see the heat map of the disengagements and so on. You can see some of the reasons. And essentially, when there were other road users, the AV shuttle often got confused. And so it stopped, or it kind of hesitated. And so the operator on board had to take control and get it back into AV mode. So some of the lessons, we really feel that there is a need to promote AV pilots so that people get to experience them firsthand. We feel that can really impact people's perceptions, attitudes, and willingness to embrace this technology. We feel equity is a very, very central piece of this conversation. We don't want AVs to become the mode of transportation of the few. We want it to really provide mobility for all. Increasing public awareness through events. We really, in fact, this event was hoping to accomplish some of that, but anyway. So, and then we do have some remaining challenges with respect to sharing with strangers. And if we really want a future of sharing, that is a barrier we're going to have to overcome. Like all good academics, I must say we need more research, so thank you. And here's some quotes from the focus groups. I will end with this. This is the Waymo focus groups, and you can actually see how much they enjoyed their experience. Looking forward to riding again soon with Waymo. I was disappointed to receive notice that Waymo was no longer an option. And I would love Waymo staying with the Right Choice program. So you can just see a lot of those positive sentiments expressed in our focus groups. Thank you so much to all of our partners. It has been a tremendously great learning experience for us, and to really participate in these very unique AV pilots in the region. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Ram. That was a really wonderful overview. Some of it I anticipated, quite a bit of it I didn't actually. So you can see that these kinds of projects are really critical for us to begin to prepare for the future. I wanted to start out, obviously there's going to be quite a few things that are going to influence the full deployment of AVs going forward. Some that I'm involved in, some that I'm not. So research and policy and regulatory, obviously even getting the public to be engaged and willing to engage with this technology, but also advocate for its investment. I wondered if you guys could share a little bit about your perspectives. What are some of the critical next steps that you think are going to be important for us to not only get on this path more efficiently towards full deployment, but really kind of taking it from the perspective of addressing the mobility needs of individuals that often are overlooked in access. Maybe I can start with you, Gwo-Wei.
Sure. Thank you. Actually, when you said that, I'm so glad I was taking some notes during Ram's presentation so I can hopefully address some of the questions that you raised. So first of all, I want to start off by saying that transit, when we talk about integrated mobility service for all, not just few, transit is right in the center of it. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to automation, there are many challenges, as Professor just presented. We still have a long way to go. We don't immediately see a large-scale deployment, a technology that's mature enough and probably ready to go out and fully support and use the system. We're not quite there yet. It's still a way to go. And how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? Hopefully get a better mobility service for everybody. From an FTA perspective, maybe I would divide it by this. FTA have multiple roles. In the conversation of automation, I would say we want to lead from both out in the front and behind the scene, and I will explain what that means. So out in the front is the front end of it. When it comes to research, mm-hmm. That's where my office be, and I'm very, very proud to be part of the research that Ram was talking about. So from the research standpoint, my office, I see that we do three things. One is we want to continue to fund research, development, demonstration like this, just provide a learning opportunity for everybody. As you know, the transit is not the most adventurous industry, and it shouldn't be, right? So transit is typically very risk averse. Mm-hmm. We do things only when we are sure it makes sense and it's very safe. That's when we will get in. And I remember the time that many years ago when we had the different ITS technologies. Now we're talking about World Congress just earlier this week. Mm-hmm. And I would just like, oh, who wants to try this really cool technologies? And they will be talking about a group of kind of just looking at each other. Nobody wants to be the first. Everybody wanted to be the second. Nobody wanted to be the first. But I think when it comes to really a promising opportunity like automation, we have seen a lot of local municipalities and mm-hmm. universities and transit agencies readily wanted to be the first, wanted to try new things, wanted to use automation for different purposes, use cases. And very encouraged to do that. And in FTF on the research side, we want to continue to support that. And the second thing is, Marisa, you just talk about what government that I see is not really good at innovation, even though my office carries the name of innovation, but government just not very good at innovation. But we are very good at rules and regulation and requirements. Mm-hmm. So how do we actually learn from those pilots, like you just heard, to inform what do we need to do, if anything, to revisit, to modernize our rules, regulation, and requirement, to encourage and support local communities wanting to do this. So this is something that I think we should continue to invest. And the third thing that I will just end there is exactly like what you just heard. What role should we play to encourage knowledge sharing, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a great knowledge, a wealth of knowledge learned from every single pilot. like this. And I can tell you as we speak, we have more than 50 in the United States doing some sort of automation pilot across the country. And how, from our research standpoint, how do we bring those 50 plus learning experience together, learn from each other, and broadcast the learning out to a much wider audience. So not just the community is willing to try new things and benefit from those pilot, but also to promote public awareness and hopefully acceptance, and everybody, in the end of the day, all benefit from this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful answer. Ram, I'm sorry, I'm addicted to this. Take it with me everywhere.
You know, I think we've got our work cut out for us. I mean, I think the promise of automation has been slower than everybody forecasted or expected, and we've kind of missed a lot of the predictions and targets that folks have spoken about. And I think that's a lot of the companies are beginning to struggle as well, because automating a lot of these processes in transportation is much harder than I think people imagined. So in fact, I think some of these shuttles, the low-speed shuttles that we actually deployed, I think they may no longer be around, if I'm not mistaken. And so, I think it is going to require still a lot of technological advances. I think we still need to work very intensively on the engineering of these systems. There's no question, and as an engineer, that's what I think about quite a bit. But then there's also going to be gaining people's acceptance. And I think the pilots, so it's very great to hear the number 50. I wasn't aware that there were so many pilots going on across the country. But I think having those pilots really does make a difference and helps people see these vehicles in action and make a difference. And if I'm not mistaken, there was perhaps a survey very, very recently that showed those around the Pittsburgh area, in and around Pittsburgh, actually had a higher or more positive perception and potential future adoption of AVs compared to those in other parts of the state, perhaps because in Pittsburgh, with Carnegie Mellon University and all the partnerships, there's just a greater presence of AVs in that ecosystem. So I think exposure really does help and raise awareness of these technologies and what they can potentially do from a mobility standpoint.
Thank you, Ram. Carol, what are your thoughts?
There are so many. It's on? Okay. So many aspects of this that it's hard to even know where to start, because this is such a change for our civilization. I think of it as like when the horse and buggy became cars, and how long did it take for people to not be afraid of cars, and how long were the horse and buggies mixing in traffic with cars? It was a very long time. But and some of the acceptance is actually generational. The people who just are never going to accept it eventually pass, and the young people who have grown up with it, it's not a big deal to them. But I do think a lot about the equity issue and making this available to as many people as possible. And the first question you have to say is, why is that important? Because it's a shiny, fun, sexy object, right? But why is that important that everybody have it? And I think that focuses very quickly on the safety aspects of this. One of the things that Waymo tells us is they're not trying to really build an autonomous car. They're trying to build the world's most perfect driver, the world's safest driver. And to the extent that we are able to provide better safety, it does become very important that it be accessible to everybody, because then if you don't do that, then rich people are safer than poor people. And that's, I don't think, what we want in our community. And then I'm just going to throw something else on the table that I don't have any answers to, but it's a question that sort of troubles me. I actually looked this up last night. I found that there were 43,000 automobile deaths in 2021. Nationwide. And with human drivers, we somehow find that acceptable. 43,000 people died. Now, when there's a human being driving the car, you have somebody to blame. You have somebody to sue. You have You can get to the bottom of the cause of that. If suddenly all of our vehicles were autonomous and they're across the board much safer than everybody driving their cars, let's say the death toll, and there will still be, it will happen, there will be accidents, there will be unfortunate situations where people are hurt. But let's say that death toll is lowered down to 10,000 nationwide in a year. We will find that, in our current way of thinking, we will find that unacceptable because a machine did it. And this becomes a very sticky problem when you're talking about lawsuits and insurance and who's responsible. So I don't have any answers for that. I'm just throwing that thought out on the table. I think that is a big hurdle for us to get over. We can make our entire transportation system much safer, but we may not accept it because we don't have anybody to blame when it's not perfect.
Really interesting point too, Carol. One of our members in the Institute of Automated Mobility is State Farm, and they're grappling with what that's going to look like going forward in the future, as well as how do you communicate with those vehicles when an accident has happened and address it. Bill, let me go ahead and turn to you and see your thoughts.
My agency focuses more on the accessibility portion. So our pilot project is actually primarily geared toward that particular part. So other than what you have seen on the Waymo vehicle, we're focusing on the range deployment for a wheelchair type of person, and our focus are on the human-machine interface. So when ADA riders, they're actually riding along on the vehicle, when they encounter any obstacle or potentially accident, how can they communicate with the outsider? That's what we are focusing on. So we did have developed level 4, SAE level 4 autonomous vehicle shuttle using the Ram ProMaster 159 model chassis. We did plan to have a ITS World Congress demo, but unfortunately our AC ran into some issues, so we have to cancel at the very last minute. But we are actually looking for a demonstration with Rancho Los Amigos National Rehab Center to do a closed environment type of testing in that regard. So our vehicle, like I said, we focus on a lot of human-machine interface. So we're using mobile devices to actually communicate. The driver can actually, the passenger can communicate with the control center. So in our design, we do have a monitoring center to actually monitoring the vehicle operation and from the safety perspective. The second area is the funding. Per vehicle cost is really high. For example, like the vehicle that we build, that vehicle, just by vehicle by itself with ADA enabled, that one is roughly about $136,000. The AV stack, including the sensor, computer, all the different equipment, that is another almost like $480K on top of the 136. So that's just one vehicle alone. So funding is a major issue from our perspective. How can you actually utilize the existing vehicle to operate, provide revenue services? Because I don't think there are many agencies out there they can afford. Not to mention, from the bus side, it's even more expensive. You're looking at probably $1.5 to actually $2 million for a fully automated bus in that regard. So that's the other thing. I think the next step that we need to consider, especially from the funding perspective, now locally or federally. The last one I want to mention is the regional differentiation, especially from the political standpoint. You imagine in California, we are a more liberal state, right? So in the technology like this one, we should have lots of people try to embrace it. But on the contrary, in LA County, our project actually encountered a lot of jurisdiction issue. Councilman from this particular district doesn't like it, so we had to kind of reroute, try to find different support. So that's kind of different than I think relatively conservative Arizona in Phoenix area. Surprisingly, they actually embrace this one much heavily than us in the California area. So I was kind of lucky to actually worked for Valley Metro before, so I'm really happy to see this particular project kick off and then completed with such success. Thank you.
And Evelyn?
My background specifically focuses on sort of transportation as it relates to vulnerable population groups. So it's through this lens that I'm going to sort of respond to what I remember was the question that kicked things off. So the research is conclusive that, if we kind of take a step backwards, the research is conclusive that cars provide tremendous amount of opportunity to vulnerable population groups. That's why so many people drive non-autonomous vehicles, right? So they're getting around using a car, even if they're low income, right? Even if they're being sort of driven around, you know, they're disabled or older adults being driven around by other adults. So cars are really important outside of a few very, very dense urban areas. And I think we all know what those dense urban areas look like in the US. So, okay, so then the question is sort of what role for autonomous vehicles? And here I think I just want to build off something that Ram said. I think that if we're thinking about both deployment and diffusion, unless we're specifically sort of thinking about those population groups, particularly vulnerable population groups, those groups will be left behind. And so I think that some of those numbers, I think, illustrate that from the pilot programs in the Phoenix area. And maybe the slow deployment, so there's a lot of work going on in this space, not so much on autonomous vehicles, but on other new technology developments, like electric vehicles, for example. And so I think that we could learn a lot of lessons from the many pilots that are happening, certainly a lot of them here in Los Angeles or here in California. And certainly, I think that we need to focus on the safety benefits of autonomous vehicles, and that makes a lot of sense, particularly around, for example, older adults who perhaps are driving longer than they should be, because they need the access benefits of automobiles. But potentially, the kind of the slowness of this process, I think, gives us an opportunity to get it right? So we could kind of think about that. I mean, I know there's lots of expectations about how quickly this was all going to happen, but I think that it's an opportunity to get it right. And then I guess the last thing I will say, and you know, again, I'm coming from sort of a research and policy background, is, you know, there are potentially sort of three areas in thinking about some of the kind of the equity sort of elements of all of this. So one is, you know, thinking about sort of access to private autonomous vehicles, right? Or sort of, you know, being the sole person in the autonomous vehicle. We talked about that. The second, there's so many, I mean, it's so diverse. The second is the shared use of the vehicle, right? So we had examples of both of those. And I guess the third area is sort of as we are facilitating automobile-related travel. This is not unique to autonomous vehicles. There's a question about the impact of this new technology, whether it was the cars back in the early 1900s or electric vehicles or whatnot. What does that mean for the other transportation services that those vulnerable population groups are currently using? And so here, if you're, you know, talking about low-income folks, most of the time they're driving in an automobile, but they're also more likely not to have an automobile in their household and to be reliant on public transit. So I think part of the equity discussion is also thinking about the relationship between new technology, in this case, autonomous vehicles, and our other existing forms of transportation.
Thank you. I want to make this a little bit more organic with folks just feeling like they can kind of weigh in and not keep going back and forth down the line this way. But Evelyn, if I could just stick with you to dig in a little bit more, you know, I think both Carol and Bill, respectively, Bill talking about the costs and the funding, and Carol straight on around the opportunities around those with greater means, wealthy individuals that often get the, you know, first tip of the spear benefits associated with new technologies, and particularly I think we're seeing that even in the AV space right now. I wondered if your research has illuminated some strategies that you think could be helpful as we start to think about a broader disbursement of benefits, and particularly among individuals with mobility challenges, and not necessarily the means to be able to access that.
Am I on here? Yeah. So this is not going to be rocket science here, right? So, you know, cars are expensive to own and operate. So subsidized access is really where it's at, and thinking about, you know, household budgets. Now, how you do that from the operator's perspective, I'm going to let someone else, you know, sort of address that. So I know there's lots of questions about sort of the expense piece of this. But having financial access to these services is key. Now, keep in mind that private automobile, I talked about the benefits of having and using an automobile. That's important, but it's a financial burden for, you know, in this case, I'm talking about low-income households to buy and operate a vehicle. So if various auto-related services, okay, including the ones that we heard about today, you know, using autonomous vehicles, if they allow low-income households to have the benefits of automobility without the costs of automobile ownership, that's going to be a huge benefit, right? Because, you know, cars are mostly sitting around, right? You know, it was one of my colleagues always talks about, you know, cars are mostly parked, right? So you pay a premium to own a car. So inasmuch as all of these services, you know, again, even those using autonomous vehicles, parallel that kind of sort of access that's going to be helpful for low-income households. Of course, they need to have financial access to those services. There's a lot of work that's being done currently around electric vehicles and low-income access to cars, not ownership.
So we know that there's a lot of attention. It was on display at ITS World Congress around, you know, just the technical aspects of getting these vehicles to operate, regardless of the timeline. That seems we're all being tempered a little bit by that. And I would say from the work that we're doing in the Institute of Automated Mobility, it's clear that one of the big obstacles for these vehicles getting more ubiquitously situated on our roadway is that we just have no consensus or standard around how we define safety for these vehicles. And I know that California has been doing an incredible amount of work trying to think through that and require information, as Ram was suggesting, around disengagements. But we know that disengagements are one component of many metrics that go into the performance of these vehicles, and you really have to dig in to understand why that disengagement happened, and so that continues to be an obstacle. But in addition to just the technical aspects of the vehicle, what about inside? Bill, you kind of mentioned this a little bit about that human-machine interface as well. I'm kind of wondering what you guys think respectively about how do you ensure that the vehicle is really being responsive to handling situations where obviously a person may have a wheelchair, they may have a dog with them, there may be an unexpected situation where, you know, it's devastating to be in an accident for anybody, but it could be particularly challenging when you have individuals with limited mobility located in the vehicle. Any thoughts or perspectives about how that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more, things that are happening right now in that space that are promising or concerning?
We have one project currently going on with the funding from FTA, Mobility for All grants, which we are focusing the HMI portion of the design, not particularly geared toward the autonomous vehicle, but also can apply to any cases. What we have actually developed is we deploy a lot of high definition camera on board the vehicle, actually capturing all the different spaces, including the riders. So the behavior analysis under the machine learning and also artificial intelligence, that give us a early warning on something going on in this particular passenger, or even on the vehicle driving, because the G-force or other sensor can detect the surrounding. There may be some accident or loophole or whatever happened. That message gets sent back to the operating center. So in our design, we actually deploy the operation center control center concept, similar to the light rail operation. This is a great experience I learned from Valley Metro when I was there. In light rail operation, you have a SCADA environment where you have staff sitting out there monitoring the light rail train going on all at the same time. So this particular concept, we actually brought it to our design. So in our vehicle, we do have staff sitting in the background monitoring the vehicle operation. So we not only know where the vehicle heading to, the speed of that, and also we read the ODB data from the vehicle, and we actually cover the battery management system as well. So if there's a case, in case of thermal runaway, we actually know ahead of time. So those are the things that we try to build in to actually safeguard the operation of the vehicle as well as the safety of the riders.
Thank you. Yeah, please, Carol.
Bill mentioned the light rail train, which has, I wish I knew the exact number, it's got something like 40 cameras on it, inside, outside. There's nothing that happens in the vicinity of that train that isn't on video, at least for a 30-day time period, and we don't keep it forever. But this is also going on the buses. There are cameras on the buses recording everything, and I came in last night from the airport with an Uber driver, and he had a camera in his car. So it is becoming more and more available. This technology is more affordable, and it's only going to continue to get better. I think that's the answer. We've got to monitor these situations and have, one person at a control center can monitor 5 different vehicles and make sure there's not a problem going on. So I think that's part of the answer.
Okay, that's great. Anyone else have any other thoughts? Carol, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you raised a question around all this data that's coming in. And, we've been, and I'll talk with some candor, we've been working with one of our transportation partners in Arizona. Most roadway systems are filled with cameras all over the place. And so these are really good ways to get situational awareness, particularly as we start to prepare for AVs not only continuing to integrate with largely human-driven vehicles, but also increasingly as they start to engage with other systems. But there's some real privacy concerns around the data, and we've spent a lot of time trying to mask the vehicles as we're doing some research around understanding how they're moving through our roadway systems. How do you handle the data that's coming either in the buses or in other vehicles that are under your domain?
Well, it's certainly not accessible to just anybody because we take personal privacy very, very seriously. If ever we feel a need to pull video data and it does become public, you cloud the faces and that sort of thing. But we just guard the data very, very carefully with IT security that Bill could probably explain better than I. But it's like any other data. We also have medical data about people who are part of our ADA paratransit system, and that's data that we also have to guard. We just have ways of guarding data.
Yeah, please. Evelyn.
I was just going to say, from the research perspective, this access to data is particularly important as well. And the sort of the balance between the breach of privacy and having the data on some of these services that's necessary to actually figure out whether they're sort of accomplishing their objectives. So not just the safety data, but also if we're thinking about these, sort of modes of travel in terms of accessing, jobs and healthcare clinics and all of that. And I know that that is thorny, but how we go about doing that, I think, is essential to providing effective services. And again, I'm coming from this research perspective, so we always need to make a plug for research and data, but I think it's particularly important and complicated.
Yeah, very.
One more thing to that, when we did the Waymo project, because we are a public agency, there are things that we have more difficulty hiding. And among the many reasons that we partnered with ASU, one of them was that ASU as a research organization had the ability to keep our data more private than even we had the ability to keep it.
Good point. Yeah, Bill, I did.
I think from the agency perspective, every agency have their IT groups. So every IT group actually govern the data based on the PII or based on the HIPAA requirement or on the PCI requirement, payment requirement. So I don't think any transit will have any problem try to actually looking at data from the privacy perspective. The new requirement regarding the camera, that's probably is something that we need to consider because people recognize if they recognize if their faces is going to be seen by anybody else's, that's going to be a huge hurdle and concern. So when I was at Valley Metro, we did have requests coming from different police department requesting different video camera system. So that has to be coming from a court order or from the department by itself with the permission from our side to actually release those information. Like Carol was talking about, we actually mask the face if possible. And then we even have a policy governing how we actually are dealing with the video footage. So that's what we have.
Any other thoughts, Ram?
I just wanted to quickly comment on the data sharing issue. I mean, I think that partnering is very important. So when you're doing these 50 pilots, I would be very curious to see how that data is being, the data that could be useful for research and analysis and evaluation, how that data is being made available to the research community and to the profession at large, because I think there's lots of lessons learned that we're potentially missing out on. And a lot of the vendors, and including even with Waymo, Carol was on some of those calls, where there were some spirited discussions about data sharing, about the rides and so on. And of course, we collected survey data, but we depended on Waymo for the ride data, the origins and destinations and the exact times and all of those details about the rides themselves. And there were some interesting conversations about privacy and about proprietary nature of the data and so on. But I think if you really want to advance this technology, we need to be partnering. Those that are coming in and doing pilots need to be willing to share the data, at least to provide an ecosystem of analysis, transparency, and the ability to take lessons learned, and then that allows you to keep improving on the previous pilot as you do new deployments. I think a lot of the public are rather accepting that their data won't be posted on YouTube. There's certainly that expectation.
They'll do that themselves.
But I think folks are very accepting that all of their credit card transactions and all of their Google searches and all of this data is being used by somebody to provide or enhance services, to provide more customized, advertising, right? And in many ways, that's the price you're paying to have a lot of these things be free. And you can, use Google and all these services just for free. And I think that's a price that people have increasingly been willing to accept in order to have these tremendous services. And so I really think a lot of these entities that are doing pilots need to share their data with cities and communities and counties. I would actually like to see these agencies make that a condition. If you want to be in our neighborhood deploying and really experimenting, you need to be willing to share this data so that we know what this service is going to do in our community if it were going to be deployed on a large scale. And that's where we can ensure that any unintended consequences do not materialize.
Right. Did you?
Yeah, that's a great point, Ram. Before I forget, for those of you who are interested in the earlier I mentioned about 50 plus communities across the country doing the pilot. If you're so interested, just Google. I normally would show a QR code. I don't have it here. Just Google FTA automation research. We publish every quarter, and we do it very religiously. Every quarter to reflect what's the state of practice of automation, including automation pilot in the country, that in which you will see all those the locations and then the nature of the project, and then if you need particular contact, then just reach out to me. There's more information there, and then again we publish every quarter, have an update. I want to follow up a little bit on the research. That's the challenge that we also face. I remember back a few years ago when we started, not even automation, we're talking about just like the share ride, like the Uber, Lyft type. And what we learned is when we enter agreement or work with partners like Valley Metro, enter agreement with a private sector partner, which we strongly encourage, or sometimes we even require that. And the private sector partners will come in and say, oh, of course, we get into this pilot with you, we will share data. It's easy to say, right, up front. But when you really get to the project get implemented, oh, we cannot redo this. Oh, we don't want to say it. That's a proprietary. And it becomes a struggle in almost to every single project that we fund. So in graduate, we have learned our lessons and also understand and appreciate the private sector do have the need to protect their the intellectual property, and how to strike a balance of the need of the research and with the private sector interest. And we don't, in some ways, we don't want to kind of really push too hard and there's no private sector want to partner with us. That wouldn't be good for us. So how do you strike that healthy balance? It's we kind of start feeling that, and one thing that we have done is learning from that experience. Moving forward, we have done is we start collecting those data agreement between public sector and private sector. We want to make those information available. We are making those information available. FTA partner with institution called Shared Use Mobility Center. For those of you, some of you may be familiar with it. And we have agreement with them, have them to be the repository and to have a data agreement for the research project that FTA funds, and make those data agreement public. And so for institutions, they're interested, how Valley Metro actually have a data agreement with Waymo. And at least you can get a feel for it, and then that's kind of consider that as the baseline, right? And then you can to see how much you can negotiate. And I have to say, there are a lot for private sector to gain from research project too, because certainly the private sector is not just focused on those pilots because those pilots are small. In the end of the day, they want to see a much wider deployment. In order to do that, in order to even have a federal government fully endorse and involve, encourage community to do so, you have to have a strong enough of evidence, field evidence to show a positive outcome. And then so it's really a balance act and then I think both sides continue to learn, by no means to badmouth private sector. There's a need for that. And it's just like how do we kind of find a common ground that we can both make progress.
Just to pick up just a little bit on that, because I think, Evelyn, I didn't know if you had some additional comments that you wanted to make, but let me just stick with you for just half a second. Are you seeing some maturation in the private sector around engagement? Because I'll be honest with you, even 3 years ago, it seemed to me that they were all competing on safety, and frankly, you don't want someone to have a better seatbelt, right? You really want folks to be engaged, and I'm feel like I'm starting to see it, although, you know, the NHTSA is now requiring some data around crashes and accidents, and so bit by bit, at least you can potentially see a point where we're not relying on voluntary safety assessments necessarily, but just be curious about what you're seeing at the federal level.
Precisely, you said. We all learning, right? So NHTSA just recently required this safety data reporting. And one thing that I think we talk about from a safety perspective is the licensing issue. And vehicle, federal government in many aspects, we regulate safety from its standpoint, and you have the safety requirement, FMVSS, and also on the state side, we license, the state government license drivers. So when it comes to automation, you get a very awkward situation where the vehicle is the driver. So is that how do we, how the federal government and work with state government to kind of regulate the same thing? Used to be very distinctly driver. It's the driver, vehicle is the vehicle. So I think the federal government, we are learning to, and from the FTSI, and Bill mentioned about this, the cost for the automation kit, right? To be installed on a vehicle. That recently I was involved in a conversation. You know, earlier that I said the research project does oftentimes trigger, kind of inform the dialogue that we need to have at the federal level. It's Buy America, right? So is that how much of those kit, the 45K kit, will count towards Buy America or meet or not meet Buy America requirement? Right now, currently it's 70%. So if you have a kit that's at that price point, and how much of that is that, should we separate camera from the labor into the camera? Should we separate the sensors from the software that attach to the sensor? And it's all unknown territory that we're getting into. You know, I don't have a clear answer to your question, but I just want to emphasize that. And the journey towards wide deployment of automation that benefit everyone, that we all in the learning boat together.
Yeah, interesting. Evelyn, did you?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, you know, we're focused on safety, as we should be focused on safety, and I think when we're talking about safety, at least so far in this discussion, we're talking about crashes in particular, and I think, you know, for one, when we talk about safety, I think we should think about it in a wider way as well, which, you know, I was really interested in the results of the pilot, right? Some of the gender differences, and when we think about, you know, safety related to gender on vehicles, waiting for vehicles, those sorts of things are really important. And then the other thing is that, you know, just some thinking about what are we? So we talked about data, but what are we measuring? What are we interested in, right? So one thing is safety. So we did talk about that. I had mentioned costs. So from the user, I know it's from the agency and operators side, costs are important. But again, my own work focuses really on the users and the households. And so really, if we're thinking about, you know, sort of low income, could be older adults, could be younger adults or whatnot, students, you know, what is the cost for them for using the service, and what does that mean? And then the third thing, which has really, I think, been kind of a shift in, certainly among the scholars, and I think in a very creeping way among transportation agencies and transit agencies, as well as thinking about the kinds of access the services provides, right? So access to, again, jobs, and that does relate to the issue of data. So what data are we looking at, right? You know, what are, you know, if we're deploying a successful pilot program, it's successful across what kinds of measures? And I think we need to think about that as well.
Yeah, a lot of things to be sensitive to. One of the, Ram, and I guess I'm kind of turning to you on this one. There seems like you know, I was at CES a couple years ago before the pandemic, and boy, talk about the razzle dazzle of all the kind of internal distractions that they're thinking about putting into AVs, and because you're not going to have to drive, you're going to be able to just sit in there, and it's an experience that you're going to go through. Now, I have to be honest with you, we've got really efficient roadways in the Phoenix area. You can get almost anywhere you need to go, but just like a lot of places, it's usually single occupancy in there, and you can imagine some real challenges if we just end up having a bunch of vehicles moving at a couple of miles per hour and everyone's watching videos and having this whole kind of entertainment. And so I guess just in a broad way, there's a lot of folks, you and everybody on this panel, that are really thinking about, how do I increase access to mobility? As I think Evelyn even mentioned, it can be life-changing, even if it's not even an automated vehicle, to give them access to it. But then many of us, I'm sure everyone here as well, realizes that it's probably unsustainable if we have everyone driving themselves around in a vehicle, that there's bigger issues around the environment and the lived environment that we need to start thinking about. And it seems like a little bit of a tension is brewing there as well when we think about this technology. Any thoughts from your perspective about, or any of you guys, any thoughts about, how to think about this and what should be considered? Are there rules and regulations or guidelines that should be thought of?
Yes, I will throw out completely and separate from all this autonomous technology that we're talking about, the public transportation industry, from my view, is struggling with this question, because I think you mentioned that public transportation really works in very dense areas. We need densely traveled corridors in order to provide efficient, effective service. In an area like Phoenix, if anybody's been there, we are the poster child for sprawl. And one of the things that we've been doing for a long time is we have park and ride lots. Okay, get yourself to the heavily traveled corridor in your private automobile. But one of the things we're working through more recently is this whole concept of, you probably heard the term microtransit. Mm-hmm. Instead of running a bus up and down your neighborhood street every 15 minutes when you only need it twice a day, you call us. And I have to thank the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world for kind of waking us up to this notion, because they do it well. And in some cases, I think my mic is off. Is that okay? They do it well, and we, in some cases, we are partnering with them, because there's no reason for us to recreate what they've already done. So we're partnering with them. We're using what they do best to make what we do better. And in a lot of cases, we can provide more access to mobility at a cheaper cost. Even though the per ride cost might be more expensive, the overall cost is less expensive. And so the whole autonomy thing is a layer that you put on top of that. That's a technology for delivering this different type of service that you could do with a traditional automobile or an electric automobile or a self-driving car.
Thank you. Well, I've got a lot of other questions. I could stay up here, but I want to hear from the audience. Do you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask the panelist? Otherwise, I'll continue monopolizing. Go.
Yeah, I had a question about, so I know in dense urban areas where people would have more accessibility to stores, they could walk, or the distances between places are closer. That's where a lot of typically lower income people would live, or maybe they don't need this service as much, but they can still benefit from it. However, in more suburban places, you cannot really walk anywhere, so anyone with a mobility issue or without a car, when they're in a suburb, they would really value the service, but they tend to be wealthier. So how do we strike a balance between providing the service where it's needed the most, but still keeping equity for different income brackets?
Great question. Anyone want to take that?
So I'll take a stab at that. First, just so you know, half of the nation's poor now lives in the suburbs. right, dispersed in suburban areas. So that's relatively new. That's kind of evolved over time. But as you pointed out, low-income households are more concentrated, right? If we're thinking about density in central areas where they have better access to destinations by transit and walking and biking. Let me stick with the central city for a minute, then I'm going to move to the suburbs or areas that are more dispersed. So we just did some work at UCLA on Blue LA, which is a low-income electric car sharing program. The users live in dense urban areas. They mostly get around by transit and walking. But occasionally need to do really tough to go to, I don't know, the Target Superstore or Costco and have your big bundles of toilet paper, walking, right? Or potentially using transit. And then you have kids in tow and all of that. So for that group, actually, having some of those shared services, whether they be autonomous or not, electric or, having those shared services, were still really helpful, even though most of their travel was by transit, because it's cheaper, quite honestly, even, with the subsidized sort of shared vehicles. And then, you're absolutely right. Once you get out of these dense urban areas and live in the suburbs, it's very difficult to access opportunities by any other sort of mode. Except an automobile. And in those areas, these kinds of services, I think, can be particularly helpful for sure. And then again, I don't want to lose sight of the safety. So if you're an older adult, right? You were mostly talking about low-income households, but if you're an older adult, a low-income older, sort of adult, I really, or you have some kind of disability that prevents you from driving, I think the autonomous, that's where the technology, I think, is particularly important. But in the suburbs, some form of automobility is, I think, pretty essential. And for low-income families, if they don't have that, the evidence suggests that oftentimes they move back to areas where there's good transit, because how else are they going to function in life?
I just want to share, I heard an interesting way to define basic mobility the other day. Kind of echo what Evelyn was saying, like what's the metric? So we measure basic mobility. I heard was this, something like everyone should have ability to go to grocery store, buy ice cream, and come home before the ice cream melts, regardless whatever way you use, and everyone should access to that level of mobility service. I thought it's actually quite telling, whether or not there's ice cream or other things, but kind of get an idea. And I do want to put a plug that at FTI we recently launched a research program from my office called we want to promote awareness and do something about transportation insecurity. That's defined by the people who lack of means to move from A to B in a safe and reliable manner and consistent manner. We consider that as a transportation insecurity, similar to other much better well-known and defined term like housing insecurity and food insecurity. Same thing applied to transportation. So last month we had this notice funding opportunity out. We do want to work with local communities to tackle this transportation insecurity challenge. And as part of that learning, and we do want to come up with some meaningful or more meaningful, not to say the ice cream is not, I thought it was awesome, meaningful and consistent metrics to define and measure transportation insecurity, which may vary from community to community, but hopefully that we can come up with some terms that we can better understanding, and then that will be the step one, and then to find a way to address that challenge that seems to be some sort of another form of pandemic in our country for this issue.
That's great. Carol?
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on that a little bit. We didn't, the Ride Choice program, which was the subject of our Waymo project, we didn't talk about very much how it's structured, but it's for people with disabilities, and depending on the city and what the city chooses, sometimes for seniors, it's essentially a subsidized taxi. In fact, the way it works is there's a long list of taxi providers, including Uber and Lyft are on the list, but the customer has to be on our list of certified people to be able to access the service because it is subsidized. They call the transportation provider of their choice, whether that's Yellow Cab or Uber, and they are able to travel a certain distance for that base fare of $3. And if they want to go farther than that, then they have to pay the market rate of the extra miles. But when we did that program, we simply added Waymo to the list, and they were restricted to the Waymo service area, which was a big restriction, but they were able to choose Waymo instead of Uber if that's what they wanted to do. One of the things that is readily possible if we wanted to extend the same program to low-income households, that's very easy to do if we just identify who they are and they become then registered into the program. And that seems a little bit invasive, but we're talking about families that are probably also getting food assistance and other things like that they have to register for. So that's something we can readily do today we have not made that decision in the Phoenix area, but it could be done.
Yeah, one of the things that came to mind to me is that we've had a couple of, and we actually have one right now, an operation with Cruise that's going on, but Neuro as well, where the whole business model really has evolved to just have the vehicle bring your groceries to your door. Now, what I don't know is obviously costs associated with that type of service, and then once it gets to the customer at the end, how does it, particularly if you don't have an individual in the car, how do people, elderly, others with restricted mobility, then get the products out in a way that's reasonable? So lots of different questions. Maybe I should take a quick time check. I've been having such a good time. I've lost all sense of where we are at. So. Okay. All right, do we have time for one more question, or any other questions from the audience? Oh, please, sir. Yeah.
So when we talk about automation, it's usually about replacing a human, in this case a driver. Do you have any thoughts about workforce development in relation to this? But then also, is there a wrinkle with the current driver shortage in transportation?
Anyone have thoughts about that? Yep.
I'm talking too much. Go ahead. I'll chime in.
In the paratransit world, we do intend to retain the driver, and we're going to retrain them to be a kind of caregiver type of concierge type of services, knowing that it's probably going to take a while before you can fully automate whatever inside the vehicle, especially talking about the wheelchair securement type of solution. There's really nothing available yet. So those are the things that we think that transition that can take care of a portion of the driver issue, especially coming from the ATU.
I think about that a lot. In fact, that almost was what I brought up in my opening remarks. Many of our operators are unionized, and so we will face I don't want to say a struggle. We will have to work that out with the unions, no doubt about that. One of the thoughts that I have is, and especially in full-size buses, I really don't think we're going to send a full-size bus down the street with elderly Mrs. Jones and her ice cream and the high school students that are, completely unattended. I don't think that's going to happen. So I would like to see a world where the operator still has a job and is employed, but is no longer the operator, but is the customer relation person on that bus. And we wouldn't save money because we'd still be paying that operator, but we would vastly improve the rider experience. The rider experience would just go through the roof because you could get directions on where to go places and all kinds of things. So, and then in the case of smaller vehicles, I could see that happening in where one person might monitor 5 vehicles, and you could still have that interaction, personal interaction, and so we would still have employees, maybe fewer for the smaller vehicles, but right alongside with the liability issues, that's a big one. How do we deal with the labor force? I agree with you.
Any other thoughts about? I know that the workforce issue is huge. We've got a couple of the AV trucking companies that are establishing partnerships with the community colleges to try to build, mostly just I heard a quote, I don't know if it's actually, the ratio is correct, but it was like for every engineer that you have working on the vehicle, you need 10 technicians, and so they're really focused on that, but it's not scaled. It's just still largely a one-off, and so there's a lot of concern about how we're gonna fill that labor need, although there is so often a lot of the notoriety around getting rid of humans. There's actually a lot of humans that are gonna be required to be part of the background. The other thing is that, and this is, that's kind of a unique use case, but we also have situations where a number of the AV companies operating in Phoenix are training their own, which is wonderful, but probably not sustainable from an industry perspective, that they have to put all that time and energy into getting people up to speed when we've got wonderful academic institutions at all up and down the level that need to be integrated in developing curriculum and different things like that. My personal feeling is that sometimes they're too competitive and they don't want to share, and so they do all that themselves, but at some point you could see that getting to a tipping point. Anyway, I think this has just been fascinating, and really have enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I could sit here and talk for much longer. I barely got through all the questions. But I just want to give a round of applause to all the panelists for their insights today. Really, it's been just really interesting to engage. So I think at this point we're going to transition a little bit and maybe have a chance to mingle. I realize sometimes people are hesitant to ask questions in person. They'd rather do it a little bit quieter after we get off the stage. So anyway, looking forward to it, and thanks again for coming.
So we'll just maybe take a few minutes as a break. Feel free to get a little more food and chat, and then we will be transitioning to a working session to really have a dialogue about this. Steve Polzin will moderate that working session, and it's going to be on the 3rd floor, so we'll just kind of walk as a group perhaps to the 3rd floor into that meeting room. So in a few minutes, we'll all just transition. Thank you.